Good evening and welcome to all of you. We start with the traditional lighting of lamp, and may I request the dignitaries to proceed for garlanding of the Dr. Gadgil's photograph and the lighting of the lamp. Mr. Kagliwal, could you please come on the dais? May I now request the President of the Maharashtra Economic Development Council, Commander Deepak Naik, to make a welcome address.
Professor Abhijit Banerjee, Dr. Vinay Sahasrabuddhe, past presidents of Medc, directors of the Maharashtra Economic Development Council, presidents and office bearers of other chambers of commerce who are our constituent bodies, and associations of businesses. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you as usual for the annual Dhananjay Rao Gadgil Memorial Lecture. As you all very well aware, we do this once every year, and this year we've departed in the sense that we're going to do it thrice this year. We've now decided to make it into a series of lectures rather than just once a year lecture. In the last year, as you all know, this is the 13th lecture in the series, or 13th year in a row. But for the first 12 years, we had eminent economists, or say, serving or retired or past governors of RBI and so on, as the lecturer for the series. Last year, I departed from that, and we said, let us invite the current Chief Minister of Maharashtra, because we must believe that our chief at the helm of affairs of the state must necessarily have a good economic agenda for the growth of our state. And it turned out that his in-depth knowledge and analysis of the economic situation was indeed very praiseworthy. And it turned out to be a very, very interesting lecture indeed. This year, I was mentioning to our Director General that we must invite more people than one. And quite honestly, we spent some time trying to get Mr. Arun Jaitley here before the budget. Unfortunately, for his whatever schedules and priorities, it couldn't fit into the time frame, and therefore we said, all right, let's get somebody who let's invite numerous people, and that is when we said that we will not depend on one speaker per year, but we'll do 3 speakers in a year and do it alternating months. Quite clearly, we are a resurgent India, and there is a need to do this kind of a review, this kind of education, this kind of listening to the other view, listening to the learned view more often than just once a year. It gives me immense pleasure, therefore, to welcome Dr. Abhijit Banerjee. And once again, in a departure from normal, we've invited a person to chair the session, none other than Dr. Vinay Sahasrabudhe. Word about him a little later. Let me brief those of you who have not known much about Dr. Banerjee. Educated at the University of Calcutta, JNU and Harvard, received his PhD in 1988. He is currently the Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In the slip that I have, there is a whole list of awards that he has received, so I would refrain from reading them because there are far too many. Suffices to say that there are so many that he is rated as the top 100 global thinkers on economy. He has authored a very large number of articles and 3 books, including a very famous book, Poor Economics, which won the Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year award. He is the editor of a 4th book and has finished his documentary film as well. The Name of Disease in 2006 was the name of the documentary. He served on the UN General Secretary's high-level panel of eminent persons for the post-2015 developmental agenda. I welcome Dr. Abhijit Banerjee on behalf of all of you and on behalf of Medc. Dr. Vinay Sahasrabudhe, I shall say, is the brain behind many, many things in this country in the past. And it continues to be so on the national scene today. There are people who shall we say, have a knack of changing things to happen, or shape of things to happen. He, for something like 29, 30 years or so, has headed as the brain behind the very famous Rambhav Mahagi Prabodhini, which has trained many a lawmaker in this country. I was a little while earlier, I was asking him, does it really work? I mean, can you train the lawmakers? Are they malleable at all? And the answer is yes, change is slow, but it does happen. And I think it's a rare and perhaps the only institution of its kind, perhaps in the world. I don't think there's one parallel example of this anywhere else, where you can train the lawmaker. He's had a stint in Yashoda a long time ago, and has earned his doctorate in politics on his thesis, which was regarding political parties as victims of populism and electoral compulsions, a quest for systemic solutions. I think he's the most apt person for the topic that we've chosen today, as you know, pulling people out of poverty in India. Pulling people out of poverty, changing their threshold life, changing their way of life, standards of life, has got so much to do with policy directives, policy decisions, and an ability of governance, an ability of delivery of governance, which only people like Vinay Sahasrabudhe can guide. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Vinay Sahasrabudhe amongst all of us. Most of you must be very well aware that Dr. Sahasrabudhe has half a dozen Marathi and English books to his credits. 2 of them were award-winning in recent times. His areas of interest and study include democratic policy and governance, national integration, and empowerment of voluntary sector. With this, let me turn to the main topic of the day, and I'll ask our Director General to set the tone for this evening's things to come. Thank you.
it's time for the MEDC to honor our guests with a token of our love. May I request Commander Deepak Naik to felicitate Professor Abhijit Banerjee. May I request our President, Commander Deepak Naik, to felicitate Dr. Vinay Sahasrabudhe. We are making a departure from our regular scheme of things. We've never had people to felicitate other than the MEDC. This program, in organizing this program, there has been considerable amount of help from 3 major organizations who have been insisting that all our members would be coming here, provided you permit one of us to come at least and shake hands with the chairman and with the person who delivers the lecture. I told them that we don't have that system. They said there is always a first. So may I request the representatives, just 1 or 2, and this should be done in a minute's time, of the farm, then the MESMA, AHAR, and Pagri Tenants Associations to please come and quickly felicitate the speaker and the chairman. I can see a lot of members from these organizations which are here. So, Premal Lokhandwala and Dr. Vidula will be felicitating. Surendra Savai, who's the president of the Cloth Merchants Association and also the president emeritus of Farm, is doing it. Vidula and Premal Lokhandwala on behalf of the Tenants Association. On behalf of the Bombay Port Trust Residents Association, J.D. Shetty has also come here, and the MESMA. MESMA, which is the Association of Steel and Metal Dealers for the whole state of Maharashtra. FARM is a federation of 700 associations of traders from different parts of the country. And Mr. Sapre, on behalf of the Public Premises Tenants Association, is here. I think the felicitation, let's wind up. Thank you. The Federation of Associations wants to submit a memorandum to Dr. Vinay Sahasrabudhe. Thank you, Mr. Savai. The felicitations are over, and now you know why MEDC never permitted too many felicitations. But anyway, now it is time for me to set the tone for the event. And after me will be the main lecture, the Gadgil Memorial Lecture by Professor Abhijit Banerjee, and then the chairman's remarks, followed by a short question and answer session, and then there will be a vote of thanks. That's the agenda for today. Setting the tone is one of the most difficult tasks that is set. You have a kind of speaker who is really an authority in the subject. And even before the speaker makes his presentation, there is someone who is asked to set a tone. Setting of tone becomes at times an exercise in a bit of provocation. I shall resist to be provocative today, which I can at times if I choose to. I shall only flag issues and talk about specific issues which we need to think when we talk about pulling people out of poverty. To start with, how do you lift the country's poor from poverty? This assumes two things. A, those who are really poor, you enable them to lift themselves economically, socially, and otherwise to come out of poverty. Second, which is also as important or even more important, that you ensure that those who are not poor are not subjected to any laws which makes them go back to poverty. These are the two things which are most important. So what is the definition of poverty? Economists believe in numbers. So you ask an economist who is poor, he will give you a number. You ask him, how do you bring him out of poverty? He will still cite a number. I had a professor in statistics who once joked and remarked that I am a professor of curves and figures, because that's what statistics is all about. Don't misunderstand. We had the Tendulkar committee, which said that those in the rural areas who earn less than 1,000 rupees a month per family should be considered below poverty line. This was way back in 2006-2008. Then we had the C. Rangarajan committee, which said that the poverty line should be upgraded and brought to 2010-2011 and provide for extra amounts to determine who's below poverty and who's above poverty. There was huge controversy on these numbers, and I hope the government once and for all decides to get rid of numbers and start off with specific issues. The cliched solutions that have been offered are productivity in agriculture, remunerative prices, relief from natural commodity calamities in rural areas, and in urban areas, food processing, retail, ready-made apparel. Then we have solutions in the form of export processing zones, special economic zones, and so on. These are solutions which we have heard over a period of years, not seen much down the line in the form of action. So it is important that we flag issues which not just bring people up from their poverty level, but also ensure that those who are not poor today don't lose their house and go below the poverty line. Housing for all is one great thinking. It has been a thinking over a period of years, and the government now says that it is committed and pledged to the cause of housing for all, which means every person, be he in urban areas or rural areas, will be given, will be entitled to, will be empowered to have a house of his own according to his affordability. This slogan of housing for all was ridiculed by people. We in MEDC believe very strongly that housing for all is not just possible, but it can be made a reality. However, for that, the thinking processes at the level of government need to undergo a change. For this, we need to ensure that those who have shelter today are not dispossessed. The central government properties, the public premises, the Bombay Port Trust occupants, all are worried because they feel that there is a new law which is really going to throw them on the streets. We have representatives of the tenants, some of them poor, some of them not so poor, but worried that their shelter above their heads may no longer be there by the time this year passes out. We have a copy of a draft Tenancy Act which says that all the existing tenants will have to pay the market rate to stay in the houses where they are presently staying. If they were to pay market rates, 2.5 million people in the island city of Mumbai who are tenants will be thrown on the streets. 1 million people in the suburbs of Mumbai and a total of 10 million people in different parts of Maharashtra will be rendered homeless. 7 million slum dwellers dwell in Mumbai. 1.2 million people live in houses built by MHADA, which is the Maharashtra Housing and Area Development Authority. 50,000 cooperative housing societies in Mumbai alone, out of which 62% are in great need of redevelopment. And if they are not redeveloped, they may collapse. And what has been a house for decades together could be a graveyard. 1.8 million people live in staff quarters provided by their employers. The day you leave the job or the day you have to retire, you have no roof above your head. In a rough estimate, Mumbai alone would require 52 lakh houses, that is about 5 million houses if we were to provide houses for all. So the issue of providing housing for all is a issue, one of the issues which has the capacity to pull people out of poverty, empower them to have a house. But if the laws are not in their favor, those who are not really poor may lapse into poverty. It is in this context that poverty in rural India and poverty in urban India have to be seen. In Mumbai alone, 187 properties valued at 1,87,000 crores have been acquired over a period of years by the government. We understand there is a thinking that some of them are sought to be de-acquired and handed over back to developers for development, resulting in people being rendered homeless. All these issues stare us at our face when we talk in terms of poverty and pulling people out of poverty. When we face these issues, people come and talk to us and say that, look, your objects of making the poor come out of poverty are laudable, but please also consider those who have a shelter above their head to ensure if you don't provide them affordable housing, it doesn't matter, but at least those who are living in some kind of accommodation should not be dispossessed of what happens to be their accommodation today. We also have issues wherein the smaller traders, which is represented by the Federation of Associations of Maharashtra, which is a loose federation of 700 traders associations. They have their issues. They feel that the laws of octroi and LBT need to be changed. We have the representatives of AHAR, who run small little restaurants and hotels, including the chai shops all over the city. They have their problems. So each one in the city of Bombay, in the city of Mumbai, in the MMR region, in Pune, Nasik, Nagpur, Aurangabad, and the other parts of the state, in urban areas as well, have issues which they have to deal with poverty. I have flagged enough issues now. I think these issues need to be discussed and deliberated. Perhaps this may not be the correct forum for Professor Abhijit Banerjee to immediately respond, but I'm sure with his kind of knowledge on the subject and his approach to the subject, we will have ways and means by which we can see him working towards actual programs of not just eliminating poverty, but bringing to the people what is really required. Let me say a couple of words about Dr. Sahasrabudhe before I conclude. Dr. Sahasrabudhe is the director of the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. Maharashtra Economic Development Council has been the prime think tank so far. We feel that the Center for Policy Research in Delhi and MEDC together would apply themselves to these subjects which really stare hard at us on our faces to find solutions. And once we find that there are solutions, we shall not hesitate to place them before the government, whether it is the Chief Minister, whether it's the Prime Minister. We look forward to full help and support from Vinay Sahasrabudhe for that. With this, I thank you very much. And now, may I invite Professor Abhijit Banerjee to deliver his lecture.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be asked to give this lecture. About 20 years ago, I did some research on the sugar cooperatives of Maharashtra, and at that point, I guess I knew about Dr. Gadgil before that, but I came to appreciate the amount of detailed and I think innovative thinking that went into the design of these cooperatives. It takes me back to the time when I spent quite a lot of time here in Maharashtra and thinking about exactly these issues, and it really is an honor to speak in this lecture in his name. What I want to talk about today is a very different set of issues, not really so much the set of issues that were just brought up. I don't really have anything useful to say, and while maybe one day I might, it's what the research agenda that I want to talk to you about addresses is a much more specific set of concerns, a set of concerns about the very poorest populations in India, very few of whom actually live in Mumbai, who mostly live in either in the smaller towns or in the villages. So let me start at the beginning. What makes fighting poverty hard? Well, I think there's really three separate issues. One is, I think, a general mistrust of the poor. I think the more brutal way to say it is, I think people will say it in different ways. They'll say it often more politely than this, but the implication is that if you give poor resources, they'll just waste them. A second issue that then comes up is, how do you actually manage to give it to the poor? A second issue that's often suggested is that you try to give something to the poor, but it doesn't reach them. It reaches, there's lots of leakage in the system. Now, when you take these two things, then based on often on exactly these two arguments, there's the third piece, which is the political piece, where I think the non-poor often don't want to let go of resources. They will make the argument that, there's no point, you can't really help them, and if you try to help them, it's all going to get stolen, and therefore, let's not bother. So I think all of this makes fighting poverty hard. And what I want to try to persuade you is that at least, in the work that I think the body of research that we see from the last 10 years, there is a bunch of things which are very useful signs and pointers in terms of answering some of these arguments and in trying to think of how one can help the poor. So let me start by, again, by sort of laying out the general framework. So can people be pulled out of poverty? And I think there's really two sets of views here. Some people believe that the fundamental problem is not in the person, but in their circumstances. That they lack resources, they lack education, they lack health, they lack optimism. There's things that they are potentially people who could be productive, could be less poor at least, maybe even rich, but they don't have the chance. They've never had the chance, therefore they stay poor, and precisely because they're poor, they can't get access to the opportunities, therefore they remain poor. The children remain poor, poverty gets reproduced. This is sort of the view that poverty represents a trap. Then there's the view that goes the other way, which is sort of, in a sense, the view that there's something specific about the poor which makes them poor, which is that these are people who are either, not patient enough to build something, they're too lazy, they're irresponsible, they're just untalented. So you can't, in that view, you can't really help these people because, you can give them, you can support them every year, you can give them, some money, but there's no way to really pull them out of poverty and expect them to stay there. If they get pulled out of poverty, they'll be pulled back in because fundamentally they lack the ingredients of people who can stay out of poverty. So one way to think about this question is to ask, what would be the effect of a big push? So if you actually gave them a real push out of poverty, if you actually gave them a chance, a real chance, not 10 rupees or 50 rupees, but a real chance, what happens when you do that? So I'm going to tell you about a set of large-scale experiments that have been done to study exactly this. So the work, a lot of me and my colleagues, the work we do, a lot of that work involves studying very large-scale experiments. Large-scale experiments meaning experiments where the intention is to figure out whether a particular intervention works. The challenge in figuring out, for example, I'm going to give something to a set of poor people and see what happens. The challenge is to figure out, what would have happened if you didn't give it to them. And the way to do that exercise is just like you do it in drug trials, is to randomly choose villages where you intervene and villages where you don't intervene, and you compare them over time. So you study them. So many of these experiments that I'm going to tell you about cover thousands of villages, tens of thousands of people. They're very large-scale social experiments, and I'll tell you some of the results from that. And then we come back to thinking about what does that mean. So this is an intervention that was originally designed by the very large Bangladeshi NGO, BRAC. And they call it the graduation approach. And the basic idea is that you need to invest in a whole set of things to help people get out. You can't just do one thing and expect that that's going to take them out of poverty. You need to help them on multiple dimensions at the same time. The idea is, so there are the particular program that BRAC designed and has now implemented for actually several million people is one where people get, the key component is a combination of some training and an asset transfer. So they actually give people, not lend people, not rent to people, donate to people an asset. So this asset can be either a cow, or it could be enough money to buy a set of, say, let's say, some little pieces of jewelry so that you can sell them from house to house, and so some substantial amount of money. The kind of money I'm talking about in the period where these studies are from, which is a few years ago, is about of the order of $200 to $300 in assets. So not $1 million, but not 200 rupees either. So some significant amount of money, significant amount of training. So very much the idea that you not only need to get the asset, you need to be encouraged and trained to use it well. So you need to be, so many of the people we studied, I'll tell you a little bit about our study in a bit, were women who had never been out of their village. So to get them to start a business where they're going to go to a wholesale market, buy some bangles and come and sell them in the village, they didn't know where the wholesale market was. So you needed to put them on a bus, take them to the wholesale market, show them where it is, tell them what the price is. So a whole set of things which seem obvious but are actually require an investment. Then there is, along with that, the idea is that it's going to take some time for you to get started. So you don't want people to feel that I'm doing this, I don't have enough money to eat, let me use my capital to eat. So you want to give people for a brief period of time, something like between three months and 6 months, they're given some consumption support, a small amount of money to keep them their incomes at a reasonable level, so that during that period while they build up their business, they get the cow to the point where the cow is going to have a calf, and therefore they can sell the calf and make some money. There's something to keep them going. So that's what's called consumption support. And then there is some encouragement of health behavior. So don't take care of your health. Don't all this stuff about Swachh Bharat and all that. So there's a whole package of interventions, but the key to this intervention is that it is giving people an asset, and then giving people an asset combined with training. The idea is very much goes back to this, the previous slide where I talked about a big push. The idea is to give people a one-time push in their life, one time, and then observe them over a long period of time. So I'm going to show you these people over 7 years. So I'm going to see them, they're going to get a push in 2007, and I'm going to observe them in 2014, 2015. So I'm going to see them over a long period of time. And the question is this durable? Do they stay above the poverty line once you give them the push? So that's the question we're interested in. Okay, so that, and as I said, the way this was done as a large-scale experiment. People were chosen by lottery, or villages were chosen by lottery. Some villages, the people were given this program. Other villages, they were not. The reason to choose by lottery is so that the places were comparable to start with, so that when you look at the difference, the difference can be attributed to the intervention and not anything else. So this is what this. So this is a program that was started in Bangladesh. It was replicated in 7 other countries, and we are interested in what it did over time. So the 7 countries are India, Pakistan, Yemen, Ethiopia, Ghana, Honduras, and Peru. These are quite different countries. So Ethiopia is significantly poorer than India. Ghana, Pakistan, and India are relatively similar, and then Peru is a somewhat richer country. So, I said most of this before, so let me skip it. So what happened? So I'll tell you first the cross-site results. The cross-site results, meaning I will not focus on the India results right at the beginning. The reason to do that is that then I can tell you results for the 4-year follow-up. So in India we have results which are 7 years after it started, but some of these countries it started later, so we only observe these programs 4 years from the start. So I'm going to first I'll show you what we will call the first and second follow-ups, and then I'll come back to the Indian results, which are a longer-term intervention. So in all of these countries, assets went up. That's not surprising since they were given assets. The bars represent, the first bar is the gray bar is for the first follow-up, which was in 2 years, and the second one is in 4 years, basically. So you can see the 4-year ones are sometimes bigger, sometimes slightly smaller, statistically not very different, and significantly different from zero. And then you can see that this is income, it's going up. This is the effect on income. This is the effect. You can see that there is diversity. Some people, these are basically the bottom 25%, the top 25%, etc. And you see that the bottom group, there's a group that benefits very little, a group that benefits a lot. Nobody loses out, so nobody's worse off. That's reassuring. People are working harder. They're eating more. The magnitudes are something like 13%, 15% at this point of time. That's kind of the average. They are missing less meals. They are more likely to be participating in financial institutions. They're happier. They're not healthier, and the women are no more empowered. So it's not magic. Not everything improves, but you see a bunch of things improving. And if you do the cost-benefit analysis, the cost to benefit, if you add the gain in income up, they look mostly positive. One country where it looks negative is Honduras. What happened in Honduras is instructive. In Honduras, they decided that the main asset they're going to give out are chicken. So people will grow chicken and have eggs and sell eggs. Problem with chicken is that chicken catch diseases. So there was a very large, infectious disease among chicken in that year, and basically all the chicken died. So that's the sad story of Honduras. Now, does the effect persist? So as I said, we can look at people. So the intervention in India was carried out by Bandhan, which is a bank as well as a NGO. This was the NGO part of Bandhan. They carried out the intervention in West Bengal, in Murshidabad district, which is a poorer district. And what this, which is not maybe too hard to read given the size of that, tells us is, so the 3 bars, for every topic there are 3 bars. There's a blue bar, a kind of a beige bar, and a brown bar. The brown bar is the latest, the last one, 7 years later, and you can see the brown bar is always the longest. The reason why the brown bar is always the longest, except in one thing where it's not very different, which is total time spent working, and the one place where the brown bar is negative is in total amount borrowed. So what happens is these people, their consumption is 37% higher, their food security index is 41% higher, their savings is 41% higher, but their borrowing is lower. That makes sense because they have their own assets. They don't need to borrow as much. They're working harder. They're happier, etc. So you get, the main point is that these results only keep improving over time. It's not that these people, once you give them the chance, they, after a year or two, they fall back into poverty. They're not people who are somehow destined to be poor. There's nothing about these people which makes them different from anybody else. They're not, somehow lazy or unable to sustain this opportunity. When they get the opportunity, they hold on to it. They're better off. And they invest more and more. In fact, the fact that is not in this slide is that as you observe them 7 years later, they have not only most of them started with an agricultural business. Either they were they were breaking rice, or they were selling grains, or they had a cow or some chicken or goats. Many of them had goats. Now, many of them have a non-agricultural business. They're selling bangles. They're going out and buying household goods like toothpaste and reselling them. They're doing all kinds of. So you see this. There's increase in income is sustained. It's substantial, and it grows over time. So these are not people who were destined to be in poverty. They were in poverty because they happened to be poor. There was nothing about them that made them different. The same pattern, interestingly, results are very, very similar in Bangladesh. So Bangladesh, the study is not in this. It was done separately. It's BRAC's own program, and it was, again, 7 years later, you see these people being 40% richer. They are healthier, happier. They are eating more. Their children are going to school more. You see, again, a systematic improvement in the lives of these people. So this effect not only persists, it grows. So then that raises a set of intellectual issues. So if you believe what I said for now, that the improvement was achieved, it's achievable. The question is are assets all that matter? So one thing that you could imagine is maybe you could just give people the assets, no training, and walk away. So we did that. As I said, these are done as large-scale experiments. We did that as an experiment in Ghana. We did that exact experiment where either people were given just the asset or asset plus training. And people who were given just the asset actually don't manage to keep the asset. They fall back where they were. The training seemed to have been very important for them. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you had to give them the asset. You could give them cash. You have to give them training with the cash, but if you gave them cash, there are two experiments, both in Uganda, where one gave women $150 towards starting a non-agricultural business. These people's consumption went up by 40%. The other one was in Uganda again, and this one gave people $400 to build a new skill. So these were young men who had been actually part of an army fighting in a rebellion. So as a part of the demobbing of making the army go back to peacetime, they were given these assets. So they were given $400 that they could spend on buying any kind of asset, including buying training. Many of them bought training, and their income was about 40% higher after a couple of years. So big effects. So you could do it. It doesn't necessarily have to be that you have to give people an asset. You could give them money as well, but as long as the money goes with training, you seem to get similar effects. You don't get the same effects if you give them just money. So money plus something. So it's not asset plus something, money plus something. By itself, it doesn't seem to help. What are broader implications? So first, and most importantly, the poor are able and willing to grab real opportunities. this is very different, I want to emphasize, from sort of I think the idea that financial inclusion will do it by itself. So a parallel exercise, we've done this again in 6 countries, was to give people, again, a randomly chosen set of communities access to microcredit, compare them with communities which didn't get access to microcredit. And the very depressing result from all of these studies is that for the average person, microcredit does nothing. I mean, it does many things, but it does not increase their income, it doesn't increase their consumption. It makes them, they use the microcredit typically to deal with some lumpy consumption expenditure that they need. They buy a television, they repair the house, they get their daughter married, but that doesn't make them richer. And I think that's not an argument against microcredit, because I mean, credit is useful for many purposes, but it is an argument that it is not going to be by giving people loans or giving people access to financial opportunities. There are a number of other studies of people getting access to financial opportunities. Again, much less clear that you can get the same kind of effects from that. So, second, so the poor are able to grab real opportunities. These opportunities have to be not a loan which they have to repay immediately, but something that's actually quite valuable, then they're willing to invest in it. There's no evidence from these studies I showed you that when you get an asset, you become lazy. If anything, the opposite. When people get an asset, they work harder, not surprisingly. The asset makes their labor more valuable, so that's not surprising, but you see it. There's actually nice evidence here from a number of other interventions. So a number of countries have these what are called conditional cash transfers, which are basically income support programs. So you can get a certain amount of income every month from the government. And again, the worry with any kind of support program is that this is going to make people lazy. So I'll show you some results on that. This is the top one shows the number of days worked last week. The bottom one shows number of hours worked last week. These are people these programs were all rolled out as experiments. So some people were chosen by lottery, got it, others didn't. So all of these were experimental comparisons, or some areas got it and other areas didn't get it. The bluish-white areas are the ones which didn't get it. The pink areas are the ones which did get it. If you compare, they look exactly the same. It makes no difference. If you give people money, they don't become lazy. There's no evidence that if you give people some money, poor people money, I'm not saying anybody money, poor people money, they immediately become lazy. There's just no evidence for it. And there is no evidence that they drink it up. In fact, the income elasticity, so let me explain this word. So what happens if I double your income to your spending on food? Well, on average, it seems like there's a lot of these increased total consumption by, let's say, 15, 20, 40, 50%. So you can look at whether the food consumption goes up by the same proportion, and the answer is roughly yes. It seems like it's the elasticities, which is the rate at which food consumption increases when income goes up, is about 1, meaning it goes up in the same proportion. So food consumption goes up in the same proportion. People seem to be it's not that they take this new money and they waste the money. A lot of it goes into the kinds of things we want people to spend it on. More interestingly, we started this many years ago. We started asking people, what are things that you would like to give up if you could? So, and they would list things. They would list pan or cigarettes or alcohol. women would say, I want my husband to stop drinking cigarettes. And if you look at the data, one of the striking things from 30 different interventions is that an increase, when people get hope, they actually drink less, if anything. So it's not the case that everybody is lying, because the average amount of money spent on drinking or cigarettes or other things you might disapprove of is about 8%. So 8% of the total consumption is spent on these things. But you see, if anything, when they get more money, they spend less, or maybe the same amount, not more. So it's not the case that when people get more money, they actually spend a lot of it on these things. They spend it on things we would like them to spend it on. So on both of these counts, on both the fact that it doesn't make people lazy and it doesn't make people go out and waste the money, I think it gives us a lot of faith that that the underlying idea that if you give people an opportunity, they will take it, seems to be reasonable. So that I think there is no reason to doubt the fact that they will take advantage of opportunity. The difficult part is well, there are two difficult parts. I'll come to one and then I'll end on the last one. The two difficult parts. One difficult part is the challenge of targeting. So targeting in general is the idea, well, I want to help the poor, but who are the poor? Where do I find them? We have 1.3 billion people. Some of those people are poor. I mean, I think Mr. Prabhu said that we should not take numbers too seriously. But if the government has to decide that it will give it to the poor, it has to have some working definition of how to find the poor. It cannot possibly be entirely left to discretion. So you have to have some mechanism for finding the poor, and all the evidence suggests that these mechanisms are very, very porous. And that's partly because, of course, people like to give it to their relatives, but I think mostly because it's very hard to know who's poor, because people actually don't know very much about, who in their own village is poor. We've done studies of this. We've asked people, do you know who's poor? They'll give you a list of people. You can look at actually who's really poor, and there's some weak correlation between them, but not that much. So in general, people don't know who's poor. Many programs, and in addition, people go in and out of poverty. So one of the things that Mr. Prabhu said is exactly right, that we must worry not just about people exiting from poverty, but also falling back in. People go in and out of poverty, so you see somebody today, they're not poor, but tomorrow they may be poor. So predicting who's going to be poor over the next 5 years or something is very difficult. So fundamentally, targeting is a real challenge. I've spent a good part of the last 5 years working on this, so I can tell you that it's frustrating, because you often end up getting mistargeting rates of 50%. So the 50% of the people you target the money to turn out not to be poor, and so the question is, what does one do about it? And I think so. Let me say two things that are, I think, relatively helpful. One is that one thing we observed when we were doing this work with Bandhan in India is we would go to villages. First, as the first part of the targeting exercise, we would ask people, we would do a PRA. We would get the village together and ask, can you show us the houses of the poorest people? And they would take some discussion, they would draw a map, they would put the houses, and then they will add some more houses. And when you go through that process, and then what we did was we actually checked. We could then go to these people, and we could find out whether they were we could do a census of the village, we could see who the poorest were. And one reassuring thing was, if you ask people who are poor, often people will say we're all poor. But you ask who are the poorest of the poor. This was in West Bengal. We were using the word Hotodoridro, which means the poorest of the poor. And there was a lot of agreement. So one thing that gives me some hope. And now we've done the same thing, actually, interestingly, in Indonesia. And we find very much the same thing, that when the program targets the poorest of the poor, the community is actually relatively reliable. They know who the poorest of the poor are. They may not know who's poor. And they may actually have different, interests in revealing who's poor. But when you ask them who the poorest of the poor, the people who the poor think are poor, that's a very specific group. Interestingly, that's one of the things we find in West Bengal, is that when you give this program, one of the ways in which everybody else benefits from the program is that these people who were lifted out of poverty because of the program, or lifted out of extreme poverty, they're still poor, you see those people are begging less, so you see less transfers from the people who are the rest of the population to these people. So they're getting less, they're less relying on gifts from their neighbors. So in some sense, those people, the people who are begging, are well identified in the community. So the community is able to identify the people who, if you want to focus on the poorest of the poor, an advantage is that they're relatively easily identified. There's relatively little disagreement who they are. There's disagreement on who's poor because everybody says, I'm poor too, but there's less disagreement on who the poorest of the poor are. So I would say focusing on the poorest of the poor has some real sort of implementation advantages. Second, the fact which is also helpful is that self-targeting works. And self-targeting works even with much smaller costs. So self-targeting is the idea that if I need some money, I will be willing to do something to get that money. NREGA is the classic example of something like this, where it makes you essentially, the theory of NREGA is that if you want money, you should be willing to work. It's the disadvantage of something like NREGA is that it uses up a lot of labor, not necessarily very productively. One of the things we've seen from a set of experiments is that even a small cost generates targeting. So you don't need to get people to work whole day to get targeting. If you tell them, come and stand in a line for 15 minutes, the people who really don't need it will not do it. So small costs generate targeting. You don't need to make people stand in line for 24 hours to get them to target. We got them to basically stand in line for basically the equivalent of 15 minutes a month, and for that they were willing to, you start to see the people who don't need it don't really want to be in that line. It's the line of the poor. I don't want to join that line. It's embarrassing. So people don't join it. So self-targeting works, and self-targeting works with small costs. So what I propose is to combine the two, to target the program to the poorest of the poor, and to get the community to nominate, then to use the training as a self-targeting mechanism. So to get the nominees who you nominate for this program and tell them, look, you are nominated for a program, you can get this asset, but you have to attend the training before you get the asset. I think that training is small, it's a small cost you'll impose on people, and the people who don't really need it will not come for the training. So you will get the right selection. Now, that's the first step, is a design of a program. The second step is how to get it implemented. And this is where I think we are still, figuring out. So we're working with trying to set up a project with the World Bank and the government of Jharkhand to study exactly how to implement this within the government system. And there are many challenges there. The government system has its own there's compulsions, and there's all kinds of structures within it which makes it difficult for it to target a lot. So we will see how to make it work. But one of the, I think where this, from my point of view, where the real challenge right now lies is figuring out a way to get a credible implementation. Because what's very important for any of these interventions is that it's not just that you say you're going to do it, you have to do it right. You have to make sure that the people who you say you're going to train are actually being trained. It's not a matter of just claiming you're training. So there's a lot, I think figuring out how the implementation will happen is where my current interests lie. But I think the evidence from this is all evidence for the last 10 years. And the last 10 years, I think overall it shows is that you can help the poorest of the poor. The help has durable effects, and that there is no reason to give up on hope on a large part of the population, that these people are capable of being as effective economic agents as any of us. They just never had a chance. So in that sense, I think we're at a point where I think there is lots of optimism about the possibility of these kinds of interventions, and I'm very glad to be able to tell you about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Banerjee, for your presentation. And may I now invite Dr. Vinay Sahasrabudhe. Dr. Vinay Sahasrabudhe has not just been a friend, he has been someone who has actually been working towards poverty alleviation schemes. And it is not now when the world and the country has recognized him. He has been working for the past 25 to 30 years, and we look forward to continued cooperation from Dr. Vinay with all our people. He is essentially from Mumbai and has worked in Gorai all his life in Keshav Srishti. So, ladies and gentlemen, may I give you Vinay Sahasrabudhe.